for like our main character canon. And by the way,
the Petrarchan tradition is crucial in understanding why the sonnet has such a hold on English literature. It was invented by Giacomo da Lentini in the Sicilian court of Frederick II. Now, Frederick II was the king of Sicily, the king of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the king of Jerusalem from 1220 to 1250. Now, Frederick was a super cultured guy whose Sicilian court in Palermo became the center of what has been called the Sicilian school of poetry. And it was a poetry inspired by the troubadours, those inventors of love poetry. All our poetry comes from the troubadour poets, and their poetry was centered in southern France or Occitania. Now, Giacomo is credited with the creation of this uniquely Italian genre. You can see already in Giacomo da Lentini's sonnets 2 quatrains or 4-line stanzas and 2 tercets or 3-line stanzas. This is the original form for the Italian sonnet that Petrarch will use. However, beware. The sonnet may sometimes be printed as distinct stanzas.
Emily, do you just want to grab Lucinda since Billy's on?
And sometimes it will be blended together. What's important is to remember that the sonnet, regardless of its layout or printing, is a 14-line poem. Now, Dante's sonnets are the direct inspiration for Petrarch. Dante's notion of the lady also inspires Petrarch. His lady, Beatrice, is conceived as something spiritual and ideal, completely different from the way the troubadours and the French poets viewed the lady. Petrarch's lady, like Dante's lady, dies. In Dante's case, she dies in the Poetria Nova, and then in the Commedia, Dante goes with Virgil on a hunt to find her, and in the end he finds her in paradise. In Petrarch, his lady, named Laura, is a little different. Yes, she dies, but the source of her name is very interesting. She is a literary homage to his favorite troubadour, Arnaud Daniel. At this canzo with this beautiful stanza, Lauda Amara, or the rough wind. You can hear the name Lauda. In Incest Sonnet, we see Lauda again as him loving more than anyone labors. Lauda, love is a labor, poetry as labor. And then it ends with a tornada. This is an envoy, which says, Je suis Arnaut, I am Arnaud, Camas Lauda, who amasses the wind. But amas also sounds like love. I love Lauda. And in one sense, that turns Laura into an intertextual allusion to the troubadour poetry of Arnaud Daniel. Dante also inspired Petrarch to compose a narrative. Petrarch's book, sometimes called the Canzonieri, sometimes called the Rima Sparsa, sometimes, more currently now, the Rerum Vulgarum Fragmenta, is a lyric sequence that is a book of poems that link together in a kind of narrative. Specifically, we think of his book as a sonnet sequence because the dominant literary genre or poetic genre is the sonnet. But it's also mixed up with some troubadour genres. You get, for example, the sestina, a form invented by Arnaud Daniel. And there's also the canzo, which the Italians call the canzone. Plural would be canzoni. The canzone is easy to recognize. They're long, unlike the sonnet. And their stanzas have a formal design that's always unique, and that comes from the troubadour tradition. And then that stanza is repeated over and over again until the text is given a conclusion. Looks like. It's a clever canzone because the last lines of each stanza are made up of intertextual allusions to other poets. This is the translation of the stanza that I just showed you. Notice that the final line is a line from a canzo by Arnaud Daniel. This line, Donna mi prega, that comes from Guido Cavalcanti, the great Florentine poet. This final line in the third stanza, Così nel mio parlar voglio, this comes from Dante's Rime Petrose. It's the stone rhymes. It's about the lady as a stone, like she's so unreceptive, she's stone-like. And then right here we have La Dolce Vita, that comes from Cino de Pistoia, a poet, I will be honest, I am not familiar with. And then it ends with Petrarch quoting himself. This is a quote from another canzone, poem 23 in his book. So in this case, it is a quote, an internal quote, an intratextual quote, a quote from a poem that is found elsewhere in the book. This is medieval textuality at its finest. The poem both extends out into other literary networks and then turns over into the book itself as self-allusion. Now, troubadour poetry was very self-reflexive in that it always refers to the authors and it always reflects upon the making of poetry. And in this case, Petrarch is doing the same. Now, a canzone is easy to recognize. They're long, unlike the sonnet. And their stanzas have a formal design that's always unique, and that comes from the troubadour tradition. Troubadour means like finder, and they're always looking to find new ways of expressing love and love poetry. And then that stanza is repeated over and over again until the text is given a conclusion. It's a very expansive genre. Now, the Italian canzone from the troubadour canzo translates as song. And by the time we get to the Renaissance, song is broad, and it includes songs as we understand them, that is, poems or lyrics with refrains, as well as those without. This, for example, explains why when we look at the English poetry of Surrey, you'll find some songs that have the quatrain structure that is associated with popular song, as in So Cruel Prison. This is the quatrains, like in popular English song. Or Marshall, The Things for to Attain, again a quatrain structure. But you'll also see Surrey understanding song from that expansive stanza that he sees in Petrarch's canzones in, for example, O Happy Dames. It's a mixed metered stanza, not the quatrains, made up of iambic pentameter, that's 5 feet or 10 syllables, iambic tetrameter, 4 feet or 8 syllables, and iambic trimeter, 3 feet or 6 syllables. With Wyatt, Surrey's partner and co-inventor of the English sonnet, you see in his poem, What Veileth Truth, the Italian canzone is mixed meter. We can see iambic pentameter and iambic tetrameter, and each line ends with iambic dimeter, 2 feet of iambs. And there's also a refrain, What Veileth Truth. This is song in both the popular and the Italian understanding of the word. You see this as well in Forget Not Yet. Notice the refrain. Blame Not My Lute, which also has the refrain. Who list his wealth and ease retain also ends with a refrain. This one in Latin from Seneca. And finally, notice what Surrey and Wyatt's book is called. Songs and Sonnets. That's Petrarch. His book, the Canzonieri, the Rerum, it's made up of canzoni and sonettos. You'll see the same pattern in Donne later in the 17th century. Even Shakespeare's sonnets end ultimately with a song. You have to think of Petrarch as being more than just the sonnets. The book is filled with both songs and sonnets. But let's focus on the sonnet, because it is the most important genre, I would say, in poetry today, right? How did it get to the 16th century? Now, you've noticed the dates, right? When you look at your books. Giacomo da Lentini, 13th century. That's the 1200s. Dante, 13th century to 14th century. 1200s to 1300s, late 1200s to early 1300s. Petrarch, late 14th century, 1300s, right? So we're essentially talking about the Middle Ages. And then you look at Wyatt and Surrey, the beginning of the English sonnet, and it's the 16th century. So why the lag? Petrarch was an old poet. He's medieval, but he's the man who single-handedly invents the Renaissance. That's why we think of the Middle Ages as being in the middle. It's because of Petrarch. In fact, he's the one who invents this slur that separates the classical period from the modern period by calling this glorious period of literature the Dark Ages. One day, a Venetian diplomat, that's a diplomat from Italy, met a Spanish diplomat and poet named Juan Boscan. This is in the 16th century. And this Venetian diplomat, knowing that his Spanish counterpart was a poet, gently prodded him towards looking at this old Italian poet Petrarch and seeing if he found something that he might like. So Boscan looked and discovered in this genre, this old medieval poetic form, something he liked that was very different from the way Spanish verse was being written at the time. And so he contacts his old army friend, Garcilaso de la Vega, and together they write sonnets. Now, after Garcilaso's death in a battle, he was killed by a peasant when he was trying to climb up a ladder to get at a tower in France. You have to remember that Spain at this time is an empire, right? His poetry, Garcilaso's and Boscan's, were published together by Boscan's widow. And the form or the genre of the sonnet was controversial. There were long lines. It has a rhyme scheme that then shifts into another rhyme scheme. But there was something in its length and in its shifting sounds that captured the imagination of readers. And so it traveled to France. And it expanded with the help of another duo, Ronsard and Du Bellay. It always seems like the sonnet comes about because of pairs of friends, basically. And then Surrey and Wyatt discover likewise the sonnet. And so in a posthumous book in English, the English sonnet is born. So that's the history of the sonnet. What about its form? In the next episode, we'll look at Petrarch and the origins of a literary revolution.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.